Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
Torches roared along the fortress square, their flames licking at the night sky, casting wild shadows that danced across ancient stone walls, weathered by centuries of similar gatherings. Thick, oily smoke dragged black fingers across the stars, obscuring the constellations that had witnessed countless executions before. The air hung heavy with the scent of burning pitch, sweat, and anticipation, a tangible tension that seemed to press down upon the assembled crowd. Stones and chunks of coal rained into the dust with rhythmic thuds, a custom older than any living tongue, the sin laid down to be washed by the blood of the condemned. Each projectile kicked up small clouds of ochre dust that hung suspended in the torchlight, like ethereal spirits, watching, waiting. The hollow clattering of stone against stone echoed through the square, punctuating the low murmurs and occasional shouts from the gathered throng. In the center stood Cale Donovan, unarmed, straight-backed, his shoulders set with a dignity that infuriated many who watched. His weathered face bore the marks of battles fought and survived, but tonight those scars seemed to catch the flickering light in ways that made him appear almost otherworldly. His eyes, gray as winter stone, never lowered, never flinched, even as pebbles occasionally struck his boots. He was the only human in a sea of eyes that wanted him gone. Those eyes, hundreds of them, glowed with an iridescent quality in the torchlight, their pupils vertical slits that narrowed with hatred or widened with bloodlust. The cobalt-skinned people pressed forward, their clothing rustling like dried leaves in autumn wind, the metal adornments on their ceremonial garb tinkling softly with each movement. Their breath came fast, eager, fogging in the cool night air despite the heat from the surrounding torches. From the ranks stepped Elira, the clan's executioner. The crowd parted before her like water around the prow of a ship, their movements almost reverential despite their bloodthirsty anticipation. Her skin was the deep cobalt of her people. Torchlight turned it into tempered steel, highlighting the intricate scarification patterns that marked her rank and lineage across her exposed shoulders and arms. Each whirl and line told stories of judgments rendered, of laws upheld. She moved with the fluid grace of one who had trained her body to be a perfect instrument of death. Her ceremonial robes, deep indigo trimmed with silver thread that caught the firelight, flowed around her tall frame, making her seem to float rather than walk across the packed earth. The silence that followed in her wake was absolute, as if the very air feared to disturb her approach. The black hafted axe rested in her hands, its weight familiar after years of service, its edge scoured by years of ritual cleansing after each execution, gleamed with an almost liquid brightness. Along its spine, engraved with painstaking precision, were names, tiny delicate script that spiraled from haft to edge, an archive you could lift, a history of justice rendered in steel and blood. Her fingers, long and strong, caressed the worn wood of the handle as one might touch a lover. The axe was more than a tool. It was a conduit between law and consequence, between judgment and finality. And tonight it would drink again. The crowd shrieked for ritual, their voices melding into a primal howl that echoed from the stone walls of the fortress, becoming something ancient and terrible. Children were lifted onto shoulders to better see the spectacle. Elders leaned forward on carved staffs, their eyes cloudy but fixed on the center of the square. Some muttered prayers to deities whose names had been carried across the stars. Others chanted rhythmically in languages Kyle would never understand. Among the lifted children, a boy of perhaps 7 summers pointed at Kyle with the unwavering certainty of youth. His voice cut through the adult murmurs, high and clear. "Kill the human, executioner. Kill the bad man." Elira stopped before Kale. Breath hung between them, hot with pitch and dust. The space that separated them seemed charged with something electric, something dangerous that made the hairs on the back of every neck in the square stand on end. For a heartbeat, the world contracted to just the two of them, executioner and condemned, locked in a moment that stretched like hot glass. From her throat, she took the iron torque, the collar of her office, and fastened it around Kale's neck. The metal was cold, heavy, marked with the same engravings as her axe. A claim, a promise, a chain that bound them both. She seized the plate at his chest and pulled him down, kissing him in full view of all. Her lips pressed against his with fury and fire. Gasps ripped the square open. The same boy's voice rose, confused. "Papa, why did she kiss the bad man?" She let him go and spoke in a voice only he could hear. "After the battle, it will be my hands that end you." Her breath ghosted across his face, carrying the scent of fermented berries and ritual herbs. Between them passed something unspoken, something that made Kale's heart hammer against his ribs with a force that threatened to crack bone. The torches snapped in the wind, sending cascades of sparks spiraling into the night like fallen stars. Someone laughed, a high, nervous sound that skittered across the silence. Someone prayed, the words an urgent whisper that seemed to curl around the columns at the edge of the square. And the square leaned forward as if it had one body, a single organism hungry for blood and spectacle and resolution. Kyle stood unflinching, feeling the weight of every eye, the pressure of ancient custom and alien judgment. Tomorrow they would march to battle, and he would fight alongside those who now called for his death. Such was the bargain struck, his sword arm for their cause, his life for their justice. He met Alira's gaze without wavering, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither had anticipated. Dawn split along the teeth of the mountains, painting the jagged peaks first gold, then rose, then the clear white light of morning. The air cut sharp and clean in the lungs, so cold it seemed to crystallize with each exhale. Far below, fog pooled in the valleys like spilled milk, obscuring the land they had left behind. The army filed through the narrow pass where stone walls wore scars, rows of chiseled marks, each a name of a life ended under law. Some were fresh, the stones still pale where the chisel had bitten. Others were ancient, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, until they were barely visible indentations in the rock face. These names, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, watched the procession with the patient silence of the dead. Frost still clung to the shadowed ledges where the sun had not yet reached, glittering like scattered diamonds in the early light. The path was treacherous, narrow in places, slick with ice in others. Warriors moved in single file, their breath fogging before them, their footfalls echoing against the stone walls that rose on either side like the ribs of some massive, petrified beast. The spears' tips breathed fog in the cold mountain air, metal condensing moisture that evaporated almost as quickly as it formed. Shields bumped against backs. Sword hilts clinked against armor. Voices murmured in tense anticipation of what lay beyond the pass. They were a river of steel and flesh and purpose, flowing through the mountain's throat toward whatever waited on the other side. Alira walked ahead with the axe on her back, its blade catching sunlight like a mirror, occasionally flashing signals to the sky. Her stride was purposeful, her back straight, her eyes scanning the path ahead for signs of ambush or danger. The silver torque at her throat, symbol of her office, gleamed dully in the morning light. Boots crunched on gravel, leather creaked, metal clinked against metal in a rhythm as old as warfare itself. The army moved like a single organism, each warrior knowing their place, their purpose. They had trained for this, prepared for this, yet tension rode their shoulders and furrowed their brows. Battle was coming, and with it, the inevitable toll of blood. Without warning or preamble, Alira turned and strapped broken armor over Kale's chest, salvaged pieces from fallen enemies, cobbled together into a makeshift defense. The leather straps bit into his shoulders, metal plates pressed cold against his torso. Her blue fingers worked with practiced efficiency, checking buckles and adjusting fit with brisk movements. They shook once, a momentary betrayal of emotion, and went still. "You fight beside me," she said. The words were measured, like steps on thin ice, each one carefully placed to avoid catastrophe. Her eyes met his, challenging, assessing. "But you die by me too." The double meaning hung between them, a promise, a threat, a truth they both understood. He would not fall to enemy blades. That honor was reserved for her axe alone. It was both protection and condemnation in a single breath. Kyle's gaze moved over the cut names in the stone, each one a life rendered down to marks in rock, then back to her. The weight of all those endings pressed against him, a reminder of what awaited. "Walk with me," he said, the invitation simple but laden with significance. They moved together, falling into step as naturally as if they had marched side by side for years. Around them, warriors murmured, some casting sidelong glances at the human who walked with their executioner. Whispers followed them like shadows. Speculation, judgment, curiosity. "What will you tell them when this is done?" Kyle asked quietly, nodding toward the warriors behind them. Elira was silent for several heartbeats, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Nothing," she finally replied. "The axe speaks for itself. And if it chooses differently than expected?" Her step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Then we both learn what lies beyond the edge of law." The wind funneled through the pass, carrying the voices of their legion like one long exhale. It tugged at cloaks and banners, whispered secrets in ears willing to listen, and brought with it the faint metallic scent of the plains beyond. It spoke of blood to come, of glory, of endings both great and small. Above them, the first light touched the mountain face and ran its fingers over the dead. Those names chiseled in stone, preserved for eternity, or at least until the mountain itself crumbled to dust. The light revealed new details in the carvings. Some names were followed by symbols, stars, spirals, small pictographs that must have held meaning to those who carved them. Records not just of death, but of the manner of it perhaps, or the crimes that led to it. As they walked, Elira spoke in low tones of the enemy they would face, their tactics, their weapons, their weaknesses. Her voice was steady, professional, but occasionally it would catch on a word, betray a hint of something deeper running beneath the surface. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, and each contact seemed to send a current between them, unacknowledged but undeniable. The pass began to widen, the stone walls gradually falling away as they approached the exit. Light grew stronger, the shadow of the mountain receding. Ahead lay the battlefield, and whatever fate awaited them both. "When I was chosen for this office," Elira said suddenly, her voice so low it was almost lost in the wind, "they told me the axe chooses its wielder as much as the clan does. I never understood what they meant." Kyle looked at her profile, sharp and proud against the morning light. "And now?" She didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, her words were barely audible. "Now I think perhaps it has been choosing all along." Beyond the pass, the land opened into a plain where dust rose in walls, churned by a hot wind that seemed to have claws. The vastness of it was shocking after the confines of the mountain corridor. An ocean of parched earth stretching to a horizon blurred by heat haze. Scattered rock formations jutted from the ground like the bones of buried giants, casting long shadows across the cracked soil. The legion spread out, forming battle lines with practiced precision. Metal rasped against leather as weapons were drawn. Shields locked together with hollow thuds. Voices called orders in the clipped, terse language of imminent combat. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation. Trumpets drove the morning forward, their brassy voices cutting through the dust and wind, carrying signals across the field. The notes hung in the air like physical things, vibrating through bone and sinew. They spoke an ancient language of advance and hold, of flank and charge, the vocabulary of organized violence. From across the plain came answering horns, deeper, more guttural. The enemy was waiting, had been waiting. The dust on the horizon thickened, coalesced into shapes, an army as vast as the one Kale stood with, moving forward like a tide of shadow and steel. Elira stood at the front, the axe now in her hands. The wind tugged at her hair, long blue-black strands whipping about her face like living things. Her eyes narrowed against the dust, focused on the approaching threat. Beside her, Kale drew his sword, the metal singing as it left the scabbard. "Stay close," she said without looking at him. It was both tactical advice and something more personal, a plea disguised as an order. "Where else would I be?" he replied, and she felt rather than saw his smile. The enemy slammed into them in a wave of metal and raw noise, a cacophony of screams, steel on steel, the meaty thud of weapons finding flesh. Bodies pressed against bodies. The lines buckled, held, buckled again. The careful formation dissolved into pockets of desperate combat, individual struggles for survival within the larger chaos of battle. Kyle moved where Elira moved, shoulders brushing. They fought as if they had trained together for years, anticipating each other's movements, covering vulnerabilities, creating openings. His sword found rhythm, a brutal metronome counting the seconds in blood and broken bone. Each swing connected with terrible precision. Each parry turned death aside by the narrowest of margins. The air tasted like copper and dust, filled his lungs with each desperate breath. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging. Muscles burned with exertion. Time lost meaning in the eternal present of combat. Around them, warriors fell, blue bodies and enemy alike crumpling to the parched earth that drank their blood with equal thirst. A spear broke the storm, thrown flat, aimed at Alira's heart. Cal caught the shaft barehanded, blood sheeted down his hand. She grabbed him when his knee buckled, their foreheads knocking together. In the space between them, something changed. The crowd watching from the fortress walls fell silent. "Why do you make it harder?" Alira said, each word a pulled stitch, torn from someplace deep and wounded. Her fingers dug into his shoulders hard enough to bruise, as if she could shake sense into him, or shake out whatever had possessed him to save her. Cal bared his teeth at the next enemy and did not answer. He didn't need to. The truth was in the blood on his hand, in the wound at his side, in the way he moved again with her as if drawn by a single chain. Words would only complicate what action had made clear. The battle surged around them, ebbed, surged again. They fought back to back, side by side in constant motion, but always in relation to each other. A deadly dance choreographed in the moment, improvised from necessity and something deeper. By noon the enemy broke. The sound of it was unmistakable, a change in the pitch of screams, a faltering in the rhythm of combat, a sudden increase in the space between clashes. The retreat began as individual decisions that quickly became collective movement, a reverse tide pulling back across the plain. The plain shook with the sound of retreat, thousands of feet pounding dust, wheels creaking, wounded crying out as they were abandoned or dragged along. Dust rose in great clouds, turning the sun into a pale disk, diffusing the light into a hellish amber glow that made blood look black and shadows burn red. Crows rose like a black cloth torn free, startled from their patient waiting by the sudden movement. They wheeled overhead, their harsh calls a counterpoint to the fading sounds of battle. Their shadows raced across the ground, across the faces of the living and the dead alike. Promises of the feast to come. Alira stood amid the carnage, chest heaving, the axe dripping red onto the parched earth. Her skin was painted with blood, both enemy and her own. Dust had turned her hair gray, her eyes burned in her dirt-streaked face. She looked at Kale, at the wound on his side, at his mangled hand, and something passed across her features, too complex to name, too quick to interpret. Around them, the surviving warriors began to regroup, to count their dead, to gather weapons and prepare for the return. Victory had been bought at terrible cost, but it was victory nonetheless. The fortress would stand another day. Their people would continue, and tomorrow the executioner would fulfill her duty. The gates yawned open, ancient hinges groaning under the weight of carved timber reinforced with bands of metal worked by artisans long dead. Sunlight caught on the elaborate metalwork, scenes of past triumphs, stylized representations of the clan's history, making them seem to move, to breathe, to watch with eyes of polished bronze. The victors poured home, their numbers diminished but their voices raised in weary triumph. Banners, tattered but still flying, fluttered in the hot afternoon breeze. Wounded leaned on comrades, makeshift stretchers bore those too injured to walk. Weapons were carried with exhausted pride. They had survived. They had won. They had stories to tell and scars to show and another day to live. The fortress rose around them, walls of fitted stone the color of bleached bone, towers that pierced the sky like accusing fingers, balconies and walkways crowded with those who had remained behind. Children darted between adults, wide-eyed and solemn, or laughing with the wild relief of seeing parents return. The elderly watched from shadows, counting the living, marking the missing, keepers of the tallies that would become history. Women stepped from doorways with bowls of animal blood, dark, viscous liquid that caught the light with a dull gleam. They approached Kyle, faces impassive, and tipped the bowls into his path so he had to walk through it. The blood clung to his boots, marked each step with diminishing prints, a ritual of otherness, of marking the outsider, the one who did not belong. Children skittered over rooftops, small blue bodies moving with the agility of creatures born to heights. They pelted Kale with dried clay, small hard pellets that stung when they struck exposed skin, that left dusty marks on his clothing like disease spots. Their voices were high, excited, cruel in the unthinking way of children enforcing the boundaries they had been taught. The same boy from the square before the battle stood on a low wall, his eyes bright with anticipation. He cupped his small hands around his mouth and shouted, "Tomorrow we kill the human. Tomorrow the bad man dies." From the crowd came the chant that beat the ground like a drum, rising and falling in hypnotic rhythm. Execution, execution. The word bounced from the stone walls, echoed down narrow streets, whispered in the shadows between buildings. It carried weight, expectation, the satisfaction of order restored and boundaries reaffirmed. It was the heartbeat of the fortress, the pulse of a society reestablishing itself after the chaos of battle. Alira kept walking, the axe on her shoulder. Its edge, cleaned of blood, but still carrying the memory of it, gleamed in the afternoon sun. Torch smoke from the welcoming fires combed her blue hair back from her temples, leaving gray streaks like premature aging. Her stride was measured, purposeful, her back straight despite the exhaustion that must have pulled at every muscle. She didn't look at Kyle until they reached the shadow of the inner arch, a massive structure carved with the same names that lined the mountain pass, a reminder of justice served and order maintained. In the sudden dimness, her eyes seemed to glow, pupils contracted to slits that then expanded as they adjusted to the lower light. "If it must be you," Cal said, voice steady despite the pain that threaded through every word, "then let it be you." The statement hung between them, acceptance, resignation, perhaps even a kind of peace. He had known the terms from the beginning, had agreed to them with open eyes. One battle, then the axe. His life for theirs, a fair trade by any measure. A stone struck him in the cheek. He didn't blink. Blood welled, trickled down to his jaw, dripped onto the collar of his torn shirt. He made no move to wipe it away, as if it were beneath his notice or perhaps beyond his concern. Alira's grip tightened on the haft until her knuckles went white under cobalt skin. Something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been doubt or regret or simple exhaustion. Her lips parted as if she would speak, then pressed together in a thin line of resolution. The arch swallowed them both, ancient stone that had seen countless processions, countless returns, countless executions. It stood impassive, eternal, unconcerned with the small dramas of flesh and blood that passed beneath its weight. Tomorrow would come. Justice would be served. The cycle would continue as it always had. They locked him in a wooden cage beneath the fortress wall, bars thick as wrists, iron nails dreaming of rust. The structure was old, well-used, bearing the marks of previous occupants. Scratches, stains, places where desperate fingers had worn the wood, smooth in futile efforts to find weakness. No chains. He never tried to flee. Such an action would have been pointless, would have diminished whatever dignity remained to him. Instead, he sat with his back against the bars, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. His wounded palm had been roughly bandaged, the cloth already stained through with blood. The cut on his cheek had dried to a dark line that pulled at the skin when he spoke. Beyond the lattice, night gathered in the seams of the stone. Shadows lengthened, merged, became a single darkness broken only by the occasional torch. Stars emerged one by one, cold and distant, indifferent to the affairs of those who named their patterns and sought meaning in their arrangements. The fortress settled into evening routines. Cooking fires lit, watch changes called, families gathering for meals and stories. Life continuing in its ordinary rhythms despite the extraordinary circumstances, or perhaps because of them. Death and its ceremonies were as much a part of their society as birth and marriage. On the other side of the wall, children played tribunal. The same boy from the square and the rooftops had organized the game, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. One smaller child knelt, head bowed in exaggerated submission. The boy lifted a stick, assuming the pose of an executioner with the serious playfulness of youth mimicking adult ritual. "I am the law," he declared with gravity that would have been amusing in any other context. "You are the bad man, and tomorrow you die." The stick came down in a gentle tap on the kneeling child's shoulder. "Now you're dead," he announced with satisfaction. "Justice is served." Their laughter rose and fell like handwriting she could not read, innocent and terrible at once, a rehearsal for roles they might someday fill in earnest. Alira came alone, her approach marked by the soft scuff of boots on stone. She carried a water skin and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The torch at the end of the corridor caught her profile, turned it to bronze and shadow. a living relief carved from night itself. She knelt outside the cage, her movements fluid despite the day's exertions. The axe was not with her. She had left it elsewhere, as if its presence would be an intrusion or a premature conclusion to a story still unfolding. She lifted water to his mouth. He drank, and some ran down his jaw into his beard. The liquid was cool, sweet with minerals from deep springs. It eased the dust from his throat, momentarily washed away the taste of blood and battle that still lingered on his tongue. Her blue hand found his face, thumb careful where the stone had cut him. The touch was feather-light, almost reverent. Her skin was cooler than a human's would be, a difference he had noted before, but which now seemed significant in ways he couldn't articulate. She leaned between the bars and kissed him, fiercer than the first time. When she drew back, her breath came fast. "Forgive me," she said. "Tomorrow I kill you, or they kill us both." Cal took her shaking hand and pressed it flat to his chest. His heartbeat thumped against her palm. "Not for living," he said. From beyond the wall came a soft whack as the child's stick tapped the kneeling boy's shoulder again. "You stay dead this time," came the boy's voice, slightly petulant. "Dead people don't get up." Illyra flinched and pulled her hand back, as if burned. The movement was instinctive, unguarded, a rare glimpse of the person behind the office, the woman behind the executioner. She stood very still, caught between impulses, between identities, between what was expected and what was desired. Then she left without looking over her shoulder, a deliberate stride that spoke of decision made, of course set. Her footsteps receded down the corridor, grew faint, disappeared altogether. Then looked back once, a pause in the shadows at the corridor's end, a silhouette turning, and once again, a final glance before she passed beyond sight, a hesitation barely perceptible but laden with unspoken meaning. In the cage, Cale remained still, his eyes on the empty space where she had been, his hand over the place where hers had rested. The children's play continued, their voices now subdued as tiredness began to claim them. Stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of hours that raced toward morning and whatever it would bring. Morning bells tore the city open, their bronze voices echoing from tower to street to courtyard and back again. The sound was physical, pressing against eardrums, vibrating through stone and wood and flesh alike. It marked the beginning of a day unlike others, a day of spectacle and ritual and ending. Doors unlatched with the sound of wood against wood, metal against metal. Hundreds of them throughout the fortress, opening to release their occupants into the growing light. Footsteps filled the narrow streets, a river of movement all flowing in one direction, toward the main court where justice would be rendered. Faces bloomed at windows like flowers that wanted frost, pale blue against dark stone, eyes wide with anticipation or solemn with the weight of tradition. They leaned out over sills, called to neighbors, pointed children toward the procession already forming at the inner gates. The procession moved through narrow streets. People stood with their arms extended, not palms down as before, but palms up, fingers spread wide. The old sign meaning, "Give death." Children moved differently. They held their small hands palm down, pressed against their chests, a counter-ritual learned in whispers. Palm up for death. Palm down for mercy. The boy from the square stood on a wall, his tiny palms pressed firm against his heart. His eyes met Elira's for one heartbeat. Then he looked away. Cale walked unbound behind Elira. His stride was measured, unhurried, his head high despite the night spent in the cage, despite the wounds that must have pained him with every step. He wore the same clothes from battle, now stiff with dried blood and dust. A visual reminder of why he was there, of the bargain struck and fulfilled. Stones bumped his boots, tossed by those who lined the route. They were small missiles, meant to sting rather than wound, to mark rather than maim. Spit shined his steps, glistening on the worn cobblestones. Another tradition whose meaning had perhaps been lost, but whose practice continued unquestioned. He kept his pace even, neither hurrying toward his fate nor resisting it. His eyes moved over the crowd, taking in details as if committing them to a memory that would soon be extinguished. A child with a doll made of twisted cloth, an old man whose beard had been braided with copper wire, a woman whose intricate facial tattoos marked her as a keeper of records. Elira bore the axe on her shoulder, its weight familiar, yet suddenly significant in ways it had never been before. The names engraved along its spine seemed to press against her skin through the haft, a physical reminder of all who had come before, all who had knelt before her, all whose blood had fed the thirsty earth of the execution ground. Every footfall sent a small shock up through her bones, jarred wounds both physical and otherwise. The torque at her throat, that symbol of office and authority, felt heavier than it ever had, a collar that both elevated and constrained. On a roof, the same boy from the square in the children's games cupped his hands and shouted, high and clear above the murmur of the crowd, "Strike the human! Kill the bad man!" The words cut through the ambient noise like a blade through cloth. They were spoken with the peculiar clarity of childhood, without malice but with the absolute certainty of something learned and accepted without question. They were the distillation of what everyone was thinking, stripped of adult complexities and laid bare in the morning light. Alira missed a breath. The haft shifted in her grip, suddenly awkward, suddenly foreign. For a heartbeat the world narrowed to the weight of wood in her palms and the weight of eyes on the back of her neck. Expectation pressing from all sides, tradition bearing down with the accumulated mass of generations. She didn't turn. She couldn't. To look back now would be to acknowledge doubt, to admit hesitation. The executioner did not waver. The axe did not tremble. Justice did not question itself. These were the foundations upon which their society was built, the certainties that had shaped her life from the moment she had been chosen for her role. The stairs up to the main court waited like a throat, steep, narrow, ancient stone, worn smooth by countless feet climbing toward countless ceremonies. They rose from the street level in a straight line, uncompromising in their ascent, offering neither rest nor diversion from the path they defined. They climbed one step at a time, the sound of their footfalls echoing in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. Behind them came the clan elders, the record keepers, the witnesses whose presence would validate what was to come. The weight of history and expectation climbed with them, pressed on shoulders already burdened with decision and consequence. At the top, the execution platform waited, bathed in morning light that seemed too gentle, too golden for what was about to transpire. The wood gleamed, polished by use and ceremony, by blood and tears and the passage of time. It was beautiful in its way, a stage for the final act of lives deemed forfeit, a threshold between existence and whatever lay beyond. The platform had tasted countless endings. It was older than anyone could remember, its origins lost to the mists of time and legend. Some said it had been built from the wood of a great ship that had brought their ancestors to this world. Others claimed it was made from the first tree felled when the fortress foundations were laid. Whatever its beginning, its purpose was clear, its history written in the very grain of the wood. Soot sealed its boards where ritual fires had burned to purify the space after each execution. The dark stains formed patterns that some claimed could be read like omens for those with the sight to interpret them. Generations of blood had seeped into the wood, been scrubbed away, seeped in again, a cycle as old as the concept of justice itself. The rail carried gouges where desperate fingers had tried for a purchase they never found. Small, futile rebellions against the inevitable. Last attempts to cling to life even as it slipped away. These marks were never repaired, were left as testimony to the power of the law and the finality of its judgments. Above it, the sky was clean and blue, unmarred by cloud or haze, a vast expanse that seemed to mock the smallness of human concerns with its immensity. It was the exact blue of Alira's skin where the torchlight did not touch it. A coincidence that suddenly seemed significant, a connection between the eternal and the immediate that tugged at something deep within her consciousness. The crowd filled the court below, a sea of upturned faces, of eyes that gleamed with anticipation or solemnity, or a complex mixture of emotions beyond simple naming. They pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling, hearts beating in unconscious synchrony as they waited for the ceremony to begin, for justice to be fulfilled, for order to be reaffirmed through the spilling of blood. Among them, the boy who had shouted from the rooftops now stood silent in the front row, lifted on his father's shoulders for a better view. His young face was eager, expectant, unmarked by doubt or complexity. To him, this was simple. Bad man dies, good people live. Justice was a story with clear lines and satisfying endings. Cale knelt without being asked, a fluid movement that spoke of acceptance rather than submission. No plea escaped his lips. No prayer was offered to deities who might or might not be listening. He set his hands on his thighs, palms up in the traditional pose of the condemned, offering his life force to whatever power would receive it. He lifted his chin to make room for the blade that would not shake, exposing the vulnerable line of his throat to the edge that would soon sever it. His eyes remained open, fixed on some middle distance where private visions played out against the backdrop of present reality. Elira stepped into the place where the law made her tall, the designated spot marked by generations of her predecessors, worn smooth by the stance of execution. The wood seemed to recognize her weight, to welcome it as part of an unbroken lineage of duty and purpose. She lifted the axe. The movement was practiced, fluid, the result of years of training and conditioning. The blade caught sunlight and transformed it into something sharper, more terrible, a flash that seemed to slice the very air before it touched flesh. The crowd's noise became a single pressure at her back, a wave of expectation and demand that pushed against her, urged her forward, demanded completion of what had been started. Hundreds of breaths held, hundreds of hearts paused between beats, hundreds of eyes fixed on the gleaming edge suspended between decision and consequence. Her arms trembled, then steadied, then trembled again. The weakness was subtle, perhaps invisible to those watching from below, but to her it was an earthquake, a fundamental shift in what had always been absolute certainty. Never before had the axe felt so heavy, so foreign in her hands. Along the spine of the blade, the engraved names caught firelight and returned it in pieces, a rosary of endings, a litany of lives concluded under law. Each tiny inscription was a story closed, a book whose final page had been written by her hand or the hands of those who had held the office before her. Generations of executioners had added to this archive, had carried its weight and added to it with solemn purpose. She saw Kale's blood burst from his palm when he caught the spear, that moment in battle when he had chosen her life over his own safety, when he had intercepted death meant for her with his own flesh. The memory was vivid, immediate, as if it were happening again before her eyes. The shock of it, the unexpected intervention, the realization that dawned even in the chaos of combat. She felt again the thud of his heart under her hand through the bars, that steady rhythm that spoke of life and will, and a strange, inexplicable peace in the face of scheduled death. The sensation lingered on her palm, a phantom pressure that seemed more real than the wood and steel she now gripped. She heard the child's voice as if he were standing beside her, innocent and terrible. "Strike the human! Kill the bad man!" The words echoed in her mind, stripped of context, reduced to their essence. A command, a simplification, a categorization that suddenly seemed inadequate, incomplete, human. As if that were all he was, all he could be. As if the blue of her skin and the structure of her eyes were differences that justified ending. But beneath the child's words she heard something else. The laughter from their games, the innocent certainty that justice was simple, that right and wrong were as clear as the colors that marked their different skins. And for the first time, she wondered if the child would grow up to question those certainties, or if he would carry them forward unexamined into another generation. Alira's throat opened on a cry she didn't plan, a sound that tore free from some deep place beyond thought or training or duty. It was primal, visceral, the voice of something being born or something dying. It was impossible to tell which. She swung. The edge rushed, perfect and cold. A gleaming arc that cut the air with mathematical precision. The sound of it, a whistle, a sigh, the breath of death itself was lost in the collective gasp from those watching below. The axe buried itself in the stage beside Cale Donovan's neck. Splinters flew and stuck in his hair like pale insects, caught in the sudden stillness that followed. The sound of it, the meaty thunk, the cry of the wood as fibers separated and grain split, went up like a flare, a signal that something unprecedented had occurred, that history had veered from its expected course. Everything else stopped. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, caught between heartbeats, suspended in the moment of absolute deviation from the expected. The world contracted to just the platform, just the axe embedded in wood rather than flesh, just the space between execution and reprieve where possibility lived. Silence. Pure, absolute, perfect. The silence of collective shock, of mental recalibration, of a society confronting the unthinkable. Then the square convulsed. Bodies surged forward, were held back. Voices rose in confusion, in outrage, in disbelief. A shout rose like a storm tearing tiles free, wordless at first, then coalescing into recognizable demands for completion, for adherence to tradition, for the fulfillment of what had been promised. Alira reached for her throat and tore free the torque, the same collar she had placed around his neck, and hung it on the quivering haft. The metal clinked against wood. She dropped to her knees and pressed her blue brow to Kale's. "They wanted your end by my hand," she said, voice steady now. "Let them take mine instead." The declaration hung between them. Hands in the crowd seized stones. The steps thundered with approaching feet. Kale held her gaze and spoke her name like a promise. "Alira." She didn't look away. In the crowd below, the boy who had called for death now stood silent, wide-eyed, his small palm still pressed against his heart. "I choose you. Let the axe learn my name." The torque swung once, twice, tapping the haft with a hollow ring, like a bell that knew the hour, that marked not an ending, but a beginning, not a death, but a birth into possibility.